Okay, chapter 7. It's a long one, a lot happens, the climax of the book. So bear with me, it's going to be a little bit longer video than normal, but this is the most exciting chapter of the book. So where we left off, Daisy and Gatsby have rekindled their little romance, and we have discovered that 1, Daisy hates Gatsby's parties, that she is appalled by them. 2, Gatsby wants Daisy to say she never loved Tom and run away with him, and they'll get married back home in Philadelphia. So, chapter 7. Does this work out? Will they go the way that Gatsby planned all of this to go? Remember, he has been planning this since he first met her when they were teenagers, and he has never loved another person and has been working hard his whole life to become rich so that he can impress Daisy. So, when we start off, Gatsby has stopped his parties. There are no more parties at Gatsby's house. Why? Daisy doesn't like them. So Nick has not seen Gatsby for quite some time, so he decides to go over to his house, and a very unkind butler answers the door who is new. And he's very rude and basically tells Nick to go away. And Nick goes home, and his Finn, aka his housemaid, tells him that Gatsby has dismissed every servant in his house and replaced them with half a dozen others who never went into West Egg Village. So Gatsby's fired everyone that did work for him and has hired different people now, and he's no longer giving parties. So the next day, Gatsby calls him and says that he wanted someone who wouldn't gossip, because Daisy comes over quite often in the afternoons, because most of the servants, when they go to the market or whatever they do for the house, they gossip with each other. And he didn't want the servants in his house gossiping with the servants in Daisy's house about her coming over. So Daisy is continuing to see Gatsby. And it says, so the whole caravansary had fallen like a card house at the disapproval in her eyes. So because Daisy disapproves of his big, elaborate parties, he does not do them anymore just because she doesn't like them, because they were for her in the first place. And then Gatsby continues with the phone call. It says he was calling up at Daisy's request. Would I come to lunch at her house tomorrow? Miss Baker would be there. Half an hour later, Daisy herself telephoned and seemed relieved to find that I was coming. Something was up. And yet I couldn't believe that they would choose this occasion for a scene, especially for the rather harrowing scene that Gatsby had outlined in the garden. Okay, so here's what the deal is. Nick has been invited to tea at Daisy's house. Attending the tea party at Daisy's house, Daisy, Tom, Gatsby, Nick, and Jordan. And Nick has figured out that at this tea party, Daisy is going to be leaving Tom, telling Tom that she is leaving him. And they want, I guess, people there to witness. So, the day of the tea party was broiling, almost the last, certainly the warmest of the summer. Now, weather is never mentioned in a book by accident. There's a reason it is so hot. Think of August, no air conditioning. It's miserable. That they didn't have AC, so it is miserably hot. And when people are miserably hot, they are usually angry. Think of someone being heated with anger. So this does not bode well for the tea party already, as it is ridiculously hot outside. So Gatsby and Nick are on their way to Daisy's house for tea. And then we kind of have some interactions on the train that explain just how hot it was. And then they get to Daisy's house, and Daisy and Jordan are sitting on the couch, and they are just complaining about how hot it was. It says, Gatsby stood in the center of the crimson carpet and gazed around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed her sweet, exciting laugh. So now Daisy and Gatsby are going to do this kind of flirting thing in front of Tom. So when Tom comes in, Daisy has him go and make them some drinks, and as he left the room, again she got up and went over to Gatsby and pulled his face down, kissing him on the mouth. So in Tom's presence, she sends him away to get tea or drinks for everybody, and while he's gone, she is kissing Gatsby in Tom's house. Even tells Gatsby she loves him. So we're getting very bold. And then in walks the little girl. So remember, Daisy and Tom have a child. And she comes in, and Daisy says she wanted to show her off. Afterward, when the girl is standing there, Gatsby keeps looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he had ever really believed in its existence before. The child poses a problem for Gatsby's plan for them to run away and get married. You can't just run away and leave a child. And I highly doubt Gatsby is ready to be a stepdad. And also, there's more connection there between Tom and Daisy. So the child is a problem for Gatsby and his plan. So we meet the child, she says a few things, and then she's sent away. And now, Daisy has insisted that they all go to town. Says, but it's so hot, insisted Daisy on the verge of tears, and everything's so confused, let's all go to town. This is very strange behavior. You can definitely tell that Daisy has something planned. And then, in front of Tom, their eyes met and they stared together at each other alone in space. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. You always look so cool, she repeated. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. So, they are flirting in front of Tom, and Tom has now realized that they have been having an affair. He did not realize it until this moment, but he is now aware of the fact that Daisy and Gatsby have been seeing each other, and he is not happy about it. Now, let's remember, Tom is actively seeing anybody, specifically Myrtle, and everybody knows about it, so just remember that. All right, so they decide that they're going to go to town. And when the ladies go upstairs to get ready to go to town, Gatsby and Nick are talking. And Gatsby says, I can't say anything in this house, old sport. So they want to go to town so that they are not breaking up a marriage in the house, per se. How lovely, how kind and thoughtful. And then we go back to Daisy's voice. So if you remember, there's a lot of talk about Daisy's voice and how it makes people want to listen to her. And Nick says she's got an indiscreet voice. It's full of, I hesitated. Her voice is full of money, he said suddenly. What he means by this, think of like a slot machine when someone hits the jackpot and the coins fall down. The rise and fall of her voice is kind of like these coins falling down in a slot machine. It makes people want to listen to it. So that is what is so enchanting about her voice. Now, on the way to town, the driving arrangements are very important. And what it kind of starts out as a manly contest. So Gatsby has a yellow sports car, and Tom has a blue coupe. Tom decides he wants to drive Gatsby's yellow sports car to town. Gatsby objects a little bit, and then he agrees. Now, the driving arrangements are very important. In Gatsby's yellow sports car, you have Tom driving, Jordan Baker, and Nick in the yellow sports car. In the blue car, Tom's blue car, you have Gatsby driving and Daisy. Tom wanted Daisy to go with her. She said she wanted to go with Gatsby. So yellow car, Tom, Jordan, Nick. Blue car, Gatsby, and Daisy. And this will come into play later. And then while they're deciding the driving arrangements, Gatsby does say that his car is low on gas. And Tom says, and if it runs out, I can stop at a drugstore. You can buy anything at a drugstore nowadays. Now, Tom already thinks Gatsby is a bootlegger, so right here he's kind of jabbing at him in an indiscreet way, and we'll see how that comes into play later. All right. On the way to town, he is talking to Nick and Jordan about how he has realized that Daisy is cheating on him, and he says, "You must think I'm dumb, don't you?" And then he talks about he has done some looking into Gatsby and his business affairs. Now they've entered the Valley of Ashes. Remember, Myrtle and George live there and over George's garage. Also there is the sign with the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Remember, they represent like the eyes of God. Anytime someone enters the Valley of Ashes, it's not good. They're going to do bad things. So this is also an ill omen for their venture into town. So while they're there, they stop at George's garage to get gas because, like Gatsby said, his car was low on gas. And George Wilson seems rather sick, like very sickly. And he tells Tom that he is going west. Now remember, Tom is seeing Myrtle, and George has just said that he and Myrtle are moving west. And George says she's been talking about it for 10 years. He rested for a moment against the pump, shading his eyes. And now she's going whether she wants to or not. I'm going to get her away. And George continues, "I just got wised up to something funny the last 2 days," remarked Wilson. "That's why I want to get away. That's why I've been bothering you about the car." There's an old car that Tom has that he's been saying he'll sell to George so that George can fix it up and resell it. But they've yet to make that deal yet, and Tom's been kind of going back and forth with him, mostly so he can keep coming to the garage and see Myrtle. So, George has now figured out that his wife is cheating on him. Just like an hour before, Tom has realized that his wife is cheating on him. So remember that. And Nick makes this connection. He says, "I stared at him and then at Tom, who had made a parallel discovery less than an hour before. Wife is cheating. And it occurred to me there was no difference between men in intelligence or race so profound as the difference between the sick and the well." So George, he's poor, he is not well-to-do, and he has figured out that his wife is cheating, and he is dealing with this less confidently than Tom, who almost has this air about him of this is not going to work out. Then Tom decides to let him have the car and says he'll send it over tomorrow afternoon, probably out of guilt for making George so sick because he is the one seeing Myrtle, which George doesn't realize that, but he just knows that someone is seeing Myrtle or Myrtle is seeing someone. So they leave George's garage. We see the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, but then it says, "The giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg kept their vigil, but I perceived after a moment that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. Nick sees Myrtle Wilson looking out the window from upstairs, and she is looking at Jordan Baker with jealousy. She assumes that Jordan Baker is Daisy. And now remember, Myrtle sees Tom in the yellow car, which is very important. Myrtle sees Tom in the yellow car. So we go on. And now Tom is kind of losing his grounds a little. It says his wife and his mistress, so Daisy and Myrtle, until an hour ago, secure and inviolate, were slipping precipitately from his control. So Tom has now lost two ladies in his life. One's moving west and one is with Gatsby. Okay. So we catch up to each other, and they decide that they're going to go to the Plaza Hotel and spend the day. It says the room was large and stifling, and though it was already 4 o'clock, opening the windows admitted only a gust of hot shrubbery from the park. Daisy went to the mirror and with her back to us fixing her hair. So, again, they're hot, they're miserable, they've gone to this giant hotel suite to kind of have some drinks, and they're still miserable. Daisy wants a window to be open. She's complaining about how hot it is. Tom says the thing to do is forget about the heat. And then Gatsby says, why not let her alone, old sport? Now, this is kind of a taboo thing for someone to do to someone else's wife in front of them, is to talk at them about the way they speak to their spouse. So already we have kind of a little argument starting. Now, Tom is going to start on Gatsby. He says, that's a great expression of yours, isn't it? Said Tom sharply. Old sport. And Daisy doesn't want Tom to start any trouble. And ironically, downstairs, you can hear the sounds of a wedding march. So there's a wedding going on in the Plaza Hotel downstairs. Very ironic considering the wedding or the marriage that is falling apart upstairs. Okay, so we have a little discussion about the wedding. And then Tom goes on and says, by the way, Mr. Gatsby, I understand you're an Oxford man. So he's trying to catch Gatsby in lies. And Gatsby says, not exactly. There's some debate. And then he explains why he can't exactly say he was an Oxford man. In 1919, he only stayed 5 months because there was an opportunity they gave to some of the officers from the war. They could go to any of the universities in England or France. So Gatsby kind of explains that one away. And then Tom continues and says, what kind of row are you trying to cause in my house anyhow? And Daisy gets a little upset. And now Tom is losing it a little bit because Daisy told him to have some self-control. And he goes on and says, I suppose the latest thing is sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife. Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions, and next they'll throw everything overboard. So, Tom, this is ironic for him to say he's upset about Daisy and Gatsby, but remember, he does the same thing. So he himself is sneering at family life and family institutions, but is shaming Daisy and Gatsby for the same thing. Now, Gatsby goes on and says, I've got something to tell you, old sport, but Daisy stops him and says, please don't. Let's all go home. Let's all just go home. So Daisy is kind of chickening out. And then Gatsby goes on and says, your wife doesn't love you. She never loved you. She loves me. So he's put it all out in the open and told Tom, your wife doesn't love you. He goes on, she never loved you. She only married you because I was poor and she was tired of waiting for me. It was a terrible mistake, but in her heart, she never loved anyone except me. Nick and Jordan try to leave, but they will not let them leave. Now we kind of have some back and forth between Tom and Daisy. And Tom is insisting that Daisy did love him when she married him. And Gatsby goes on, or Tom goes on and says, I love Daisy too. Once in a while I go off on a spree and make a fool of myself, but I always come back, and in my heart I love her all the time. So he says, I go off and have an affair every now and then, but I always come back, and I love her all the time. And Daisy says, you're revolting. Now, she still has not said what Gatsby wants her to say, which is she never loved Tom. And then Nick notices, as though she realized at last what she was doing, and as though she had never all along intended doing anything at all. But it was done now. It was too late. So it seems that this has gone further than Daisy figured it would go. Like, she didn't realize how deep into this she would get. So she says, I never loved him. And then Tom brings up some events from their marriage. And then she tells Gatsby, you want too much. I love you now. Isn't that enough? I can't help what's past, she began. I did love him once, but I love you too. And Gatsby is shocked by this, and she says, you loved me too? Now, Gatsby is so upset by this because there's never been anyone for him except Daisy. And he's been holding on to this notion that him and Daisy will be able to repeat the past and continue as if nothing has changed, nothing has ever happened. Daisy moved on from him. He never moved on. So you have to understand that for Gatsby, this is a blow to realize that there was a point where Daisy moved on and was not in love with Gatsby anymore. And then she goes on to say that she did once love Tom. And then Gatsby is kind of starting to get into a panic. And this is the first time we've seen him really lose his composure. Tells Tom, you're not going to take care of her anymore. And Tom gets he's very confident, says, I'm not. Why's that? And Gatsby says, well, Daisy's leaving you. And he says, no, she's not leaving me. And he's very confident in this. And Daisy still just wants to go home. Now, Tom is about to break some news to the party about how Gatsby has made his money. So he's about to really lay it on thick. He said, I found out what your drugstores were. Remember, he said you can buy anything at a drugstore. He turned to us and spoke rapidly. He and this Wolfsheim brought up a lot of side street drugstores here and in Chicago and sold grain alcohol over the counter. That's one of his little stunts. I picked him for a bootlegger the first time I saw him, and I wasn't far wrong. So, we've learned that Gatsby has made his millions selling alcohol illegally over the counter of drugstores. So, he is, in fact, a bootlegger. Then he talks about a friend and the type of relations he has with people when they break his trust and how they can basically financially ruin them. And then he goes on and says that drugstore business was just small change, continued Tom slowly, but you've got something on now that Walter's afraid to tell me about. Walter is a guy who basically was broke off. He didn't do what he was supposed to, so Wolfsheim broke ties with him and basically took all his money. So now he is insinuating that Gatsby is involved with more illegal things than just bootlegging alcohol. Nick glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband and at Jordan. So, Daisy is terrified by this notion. She's not confident about it anymore. She has broken any willpower she had to leave Tom at this point. And then she goes on and says, please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore. Her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions, whatever courage she had had were definitely gone, and now she's begging Tom to go home. And Tom sends her home in Gatsby's car. So now, the driving arrangements to go back to West Egg. In the yellow car, we have Daisy and Gatsby. In the blue car, we have Tom, Nick, and Jordan. So they have swapped cars from when they were going to town. Okay, so Daisy and Gatsby leave, and then Nick has a revelation and remembers that today is his birthday. He has been so absorbed with everything going on that he has forgotten his own birthday. And then they continue on to go back to West Egg. And it says, so we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. That is a foreshadow there. They get into the Valley of Ashes. Sorry. And then we kind of cut to George and Myrtle and the neighbor McKaylee's. It says he talks about he locked his wife away and she's going to stay there until they move away. George is talking to everybody as if he's suspicious of them because he doesn't know who Myrtle is cheating on him with. Okay? And then a moment later, Myrtle rushes out into the darkness, waving her hands and shouting. Before he could move from his door, the business was over. The death car, as the newspapers called it, didn't stop. It came out of the gathering darkness, wavered tragically for a moment, and then disappeared around the next bend. McKaylee's wasn't even sure of its color. He told the first policeman that it was light green. The other car, the one going toward New York, came to a rest 100 yards beyond. Okay, so Myrtle has run out into the road and been run over by a car, and the car does not stop. And then it says McKaylee's and this man reached her first, but when they had torn open her shirtwaist, still damp with perspiration, they saw that her left breast was swinging loose like a flap, and there was no need to listen for the heart beneath. The mouth was wide open and ripped at the corners as though she had choked a little in giving up the tremendous vitality she had stored so long. So Myrtle is now dead, and this is quite a gruesome scene of Myrtle, but she is considered a very good-looking person, and she has kind of lost all that in her death. Okay, so Tom and Nick and Jordan drive up on this scene after it happens, and Tom decides he's going to stop and see what's up. All he sees is like this commotion around Wilson's garage, so he decides he'll stop and see what's going on. Then he sees Myrtle Wilson and realizes that she is the one who has died, and George, her husband, is beside himself. The police are taking some names. Tom asks what happened. Someone says auto hit her, instantly killed. It says she ran out in the road. Guy didn't even stop his car. And then they said there are two cars, one going each way. And then someone chimes in and says it was a yellow car. Big yellow car, new. So now we know that Gatsby's car has hit and killed Myrtle and did not even stop. So Tom is hearing all of this. He knows who the yellow car belongs to. So in Tom's mind now, Gatsby has not only taken away Daisy, but has also killed Myrtle. So they keep going on. Now, remember, George saw Tom earlier in the day in a yellow car. So George is starting to think that Tom killed Myrtle. Now, also remember, Myrtle was probably running out to this yellow car because she also saw Tom in the yellow car earlier in the day. Tom calms George down a little bit and says, listen, I just got here a minute ago from New York. I was bringing you that coupe we've been talking about. That yellow car I was driving wasn't mine. I haven't seen it all afternoon. So Tom is trying to reassure George that he is not the one that was driving the yellow car. Okay. Then they leave, and as they're leaving, Tom is crying. So this tells us he might have some sort of feelings for Myrtle. Somewhere in there. Did he plan on marrying her and leaving Daisy? No. But he did have some kind of feelings for her, and now he is very angry with Gatsby. So they get to the Buchanan's house. Daisy is already home, and Tom tells Nick he will get a taxi to take him home, ask if he wants to come in, and Nick does not want to come in. He says, I was feeling a little sick and I wanted to be alone. Jordan wants him to go in. He says, I'd be damned if I'd go in. I'd had enough of all of them for one day, and suddenly that included Jordan too. Nick is tired of their drama. He's tired of the people that they are. He has come to a point where he has no more tolerance for them. As he's waiting for the taxi, he starts walking down the driveway and he sees Gatsby hanging out. And he asks Gatsby, what you doing? And Gatsby says he's going to stay there and make sure that there's no trouble between Daisy and Tom. Then he asks about trouble on the road and asks if Myrtle was killed, and Nick says yes. Then he goes on and talks about the wreck, who she was, and then Nick realizes Daisy was driving. So it was not Gatsby who hit Myrtle and didn't stop. It was Daisy. And Gatsby says, yes, but of course I'll say I was. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous. So, Daisy has killed without knowing that this is, like, she did not go after Myrtle. She did not know that Myrtle was the one that was seeing Tom. Daisy, Tom's wife, is the one who killed Myrtle. Now, Tom does not know this. He thinks it was Gatsby, and Daisy's going to let him think that, and she's not going to tell him the truth. So, we have that whole ordeal. Gatsby says, I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't, so I pulled the emergency brake. Then she fell over into my lap, and I drove on. Okay? And then Gatsby talks about how he doesn't trust Tom, and he's going to stay there until they go to sleep to make sure there's no commotion. And Nick says, well, I'll go look in a window and see what's going on and let you know. So when Nick does, he sees Daisy and Tom sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness his hand had fallen upon and covered her own. Once in a while she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. So, we have Tom and Daisy planning something now, and it appears that they have resolved their issue to where they are no longer angry with each other, and it does seem that they are having a conversation and planning something. This does not bode well for Gatsby, because Gatsby still thinks that Daisy is going to leave Tom. Now, whether that happens or not, we're not sure yet, but Gatsby is still all for Daisy leaving Tom. So he asks if it's all quiet up there. Nick says yes. Gatsby says he's going to stay, and Nick goes home. So now we have some loose ends to tie up. Do Daisy and Tom stay together? Does Daisy tell Tom about that she's the one that was driving? Do they leave? Does Gatsby leave? What happens? Who ends up with who? We will find out in Chapter 8.